Welcome to our segment called Washington Current Review. This will be hosted by the famous, or properly said, this man fits into the class of rich and famous. He is none other than Mr. Frank Islam, who is the chairman and CEO of FI Investment Group, located in Tysons Corner, Virginia. Today, Mr. Islam's guest of honor is Ms. Terry M. Au from the Asian American Justice Center. Let's join these two famous personalities in their deep conversation.
This is Frank Islam, the chairman and CEO of FI Investment Group and your host of Washington Current Review, where we interview leading voices from business and politics and explore topics of current interest that impact you, the viewer. Today, our guest is Terry O, Director of the Census and Voting Programs for the Asian American Justice Center, and we'll be talking about Asian American voting issues. Welcome, Terry. Thanks very much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Let me ask you a question. What barriers exist for Asian Americans, including Indian Americans, which impede their ability to get equal access to the voting process in this country?
Well, I think one of the main issues that we have for the Asian American community, including the Indian American community, are cultural and linguistic barriers to the voting process. It is not always the easiest of processes to understand. Certainly for those who have immigrated into this country, there are a lot of different procedures and steps, and of course they differ from state to state, from place to place, so it can become very confusing. On top of that, the ballots themselves often are confusing, and with the English language proficiency concerns for some of those in our community, as well as for those who may be fluent in the language, the way the ballots are written oftentimes can be confusing. On top of that, even if our community members are able to get to the polling locations, sometimes they're met with hostile poll workers, those who perhaps send them to the back of the line if they don't speak English as well as a native-born American, or you have just poll workers who have been poorly trained, who don't know the rules very well, who just give wrong information, unfortunately, to our community.
Thank you. Let me ask you the next question. Why is Census 2010 so critical to Asian American participation in the elections?
Well, Census 2010 is the decennial census that is taken, and the reason why it's so important for electoral participation is because it is the basis by which reapportionment of congressional seats happen, as well as how redistricting for those seats happen. And I think that a lot of times people don't necessarily get the connection between the two, but the reality is if you're not counted in the census number, then you won't be counted for those purposes, so you won't have the representation that you deserve and that you need to make sure that your community's interests are addressed.
Good point. Next question. How does Census 2010 differ from the early American Community Survey?
Well, the American Community Survey is a new invention, if you will, of the Census Bureau. The way the decennial census has been taken in the past, you had two different forms, a short form and then you had a long form. The short form asked very basic questions such as name, age, date of birth, race, ethnicity, with respect
This is done by Census Bureau?
This is done by the Census Bureau. And then there was a long form that asked more socioeconomic type questions such as language abilities, educational attainment, income levels, and that's where we could get a lot of our rich data from. So what they've done is replace the long form with the American Community Survey. And the reason for doing this is that it's an ongoing survey and the data is reported out on an annual basis, which in theory would provide more up-to-date information on our communities than waiting every 10 years.
Well, thank you. As you know, that as you said not too long ago, the Asian Americans are the immigrants, Indian, and they don't speak the language very well, and you said that. My question to you is, what steps have the government put in place to address language and other barriers that some Asian Americans face?
Well, with respect to the 2010 census, we know that the Census Bureau has decided to provide primary language assistance in 3 Asian languages, Korean, Chinese, and Vietnamese. And by primary language assistance, they mean that they will be providing a translated questionnaire, census questionnaire, that can be filled out, as well as provide telephone assistance. They are also, for other languages, because they recognize how diverse this country is and how many different languages are spoken, we'll be providing language assistance guides, which are sort of like translated sample questionnaires that can be placed side by side with the English version in about around 50 languages. I don't believe that they've come up with all the languages, the list of languages yet, but for certain, there will be plenty of Asian languages represented in that list.
Well, in India has a lot of languages.
Correct.
So how do you correct that situation? How do you make sure that the Asian Americans can vote in their own language as far as India is concerned?
I think for the Asian Americans voting in language, there is a federal provision called Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act. Interestingly, this also ties back to census, because in order to qualify or reach the threshold level for Section 203, it actually depends on ACS, the American Community Survey data. So once again, it really highlights the importance of our communities participating not only in Census 2010 but the American Community Survey, because if we don't answer the forms, we aren't counted, and if we're not counted, we can't be represented in many different facets of our community.
Thank you. As you know, we're going to have election in November. Mm-hmm. Both parties, Democrats and the Republican, both have their own platforms, policies, plans, and promises, mm-hmm. and issues. My question to you is, what should Asian Americans keep in mind when they vote this November?
I think the most important thing for Asian Americans, of course, they should do their due diligence, do their homework, and make whatever decision they want as to who they're voting for. Asian American Justice Center is a national nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, so we certainly have no interest in who people are voting for. Our interest is that people are voting, that they are taking the initiative and taking their right and capitalizing on it. So I think what's really important is that people know their rights when they go in, make sure that to the extent that they can, they understand the process, as I had mentioned, can be somewhat complicated. And certainly people can visit our website, www.advancingequality.org, to find out more information. But know your rights. Don't let perhaps poorly trained poll workers push you around. And if you have any problems, call the National Election Protection Hotline, 1-866-RVOTE.
National Protection Hotline.
Yes, we are a partner organization with other folks that are working on this. And it's important, this hotline is there to answer questions for people who are confused by the electoral process, but also for voters on Election Day if they run into problems. So the important thing is, if you run into a problem on Election Day, call the hotline before you're forced to cast a ballot or anything, if you feel as if you're being unfairly pressured.
Well, thank you very, very much. You have shed light on the process of the voting, so I appreciate that very much. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you, and I look forward to coming back to possibly talk more about census as we get closer to Census 2010.
Well, we'd love to have you back. Thank you, Terry. That is our show. Until next time, this is Frank Islam of FY Investment Group wishing you a great week.